Anyway, this is my early learnings of Hanami. I've added some more learnings since then. And, this is a combination of my learnings from that. This presentation isn't fully fleshed out, and I'll admit I took the whole day off today to put this together. Maybe because I also woke up late because I was at the soccer last night. Go Matildas. All right, Hanami. This is from their website. So whether or not that means anything, it's their marketing tool, I guess. Hanami fast response times. Hanami is a modern web framework for Ruby. It's meant to be fast, meant to be lighter, use a lot less memory. The bottom left, full featured but lightweight, 60% less memory. Top right, secure by default. I guess that's you'd hope any framework would have that these days. So I don't know if that's a huge selling point. I don't work for Hanami or anything, so I'm not. This is not me trying to sell it or anything. And simple and productive. I think I would agree with that so far from my learnings. It is pretty simple, and they embrace. I think it was written based on all these like sort of fundamental, solid principles, and the idea of single responsibility, separating your concerns. Whether or not that's feasible as your app gets bigger is another question, but the intent is there. Whether that's a good intent, we'll see. Let's find out. So why Hanami? Pros, great for fast and light APIs. So I'm doing Hanami 2.0 today. The previous version, Hanami 1.3, I think was more supported for front end, for views, but in their 2.0 version, they've canned that. We're not focusing on views, we're focusing on creating APIs. So I think that's what's Hanami's best use. Forces good develop habits. That's actually what the senior engineer told me. It's like it forces good develop habits. It forces you to write, separate your concerns, all that stuff that you're meant to do as a good developer. All the stuff we talk about, but we never really do in practice. And why? It's just fun to try something new. Fun to learn a new framework. I've learned. I'm only a junior developer. Been in this for like a year and a half. But learning new frameworks is, it gets me out of this Rails thinking. Might start trying other different languages. Elixir. I've heard Hanami, I think, is quite similar to Node, to Express maybe. So cons, it's still very new, small community. There's a lot of things that are still not supported. I even read on their guides today. They're up to, so it's version 2.0, and they're saying in 2.1, like their database system is going to be supported. Actually, yes, can you change this layout so it's a bit like Spotlight? Actually, I'll do it. Grab on the full screen experience. Here we go. Spotlight. Minimize this. How do we minimize it? Layout. Yeah. Nice. IT support. That's Hanami. No, that's my opinions. My opinions as a junior developer who's been doing this for, I don't know, maybe a month and a half tops, here and there in my spare time. All right, so how does it compare to Rails? So we know we can put in the command line Rails new, and we'll call it my Rails app, and it generates this kind of structure. Hanami is not too similar. Hanami, it's got the same kind of commands that you can put in. You can generate same kind of things that you can generate with Rails. You can do Hanami C, like you can do Rails C, Rails console, Hanami console, Rails routes, Hanami routes. So Hanami new, my Hanami app. And it's got, we can focus on, we can see there's less things, but you can see the app is the same. We have a lib. Rails has DB. Hanami does not have DB by default. Doesn't specify what DB you should choose. You can see by default, without any flags, Rails will create test folder with mini test, but Hanami likes RSpec, and I like RSpec. And, if I'm starting a new Rails app, I'll just install RSpec anyway. So I'm glad that Hanami has it already pre-packaged with it. Let's look a bit closer at the gem file in Rails. So Rails, the database is without any flags, SQL, and Hanami, obviously no database. We mentioned mini tests versus RSpec. Rails, there's a bunch of other web gems, Turbo, Rails, Sprockets, all that. Probably less if you want to start a Rails app just as an API. Hanami is just these Hanami gems, and Hanami also has dry type by default. So it's this whole idea of forcing good developer habits on us. So that's something that's new to me, and I've enjoyed trying dry types, dry RB, dry validations out. So that's what Hanami comes pre-packaged with. Close look. I don't know if you can really read that. You're not intended to read it, but Rails gem file on the left, Hanami gem file on the right. You can see there's a bunch of like pre-made Hanami libraries. They've both got Puma. So on the left, this is like a full web Rails app for Rails 7. Anyway, enough of that. Let's write something. So I've made myself a little task, 3 tickets here. I'm not going to actually write much here. This is just a presentation. I'm just clicking. We're going to fetch data from a spreadsheet. This is a fake task I've created. Fetch data from a spreadsheet. We're going to store that data in a database, and we're going to create an endpoint to return that data. Basic API stuff. Maybe not the fetch data from a spreadsheet, but that's a good example for showing one of Hanami's great utilities. So that's our task. Let's see if we can get this done in 15 minutes. Can you give me a time check at some point? Yes. All right, let's fetch the data from a spreadsheet. Here's one I prepared earlier. Some Google sheet. Don't worry too much about it. It's a spreadsheet. There's data in there. There's like 600 rows and I don't know, 40 columns. You can ask me about what that is later. Here's our class. We've got a class. This is before we've done anything really Hanami. This can work in Rails. Class to fetch data from a spreadsheet, from a Google Sheets worksheet. So we've got a class called spreadsheet. Don't worry about like code reviews or anything here. I'm not. I just wrote this as a proof of concept. We've got a couple constants, spreadsheet key, and the worksheet title, which comes from the Google Sheets, obviously. It uses .env to get these variables. Maybe you wouldn't recommend it for production environments, but this is back to the gem file. You can see it comes pre-packaged with .env for development and test, so may as well go with it if that's what it recommends. So there's our constants. We've got two public methods, standard initialize and a fetch method. In Hanami 1.3, this is from their guides, screenshot from them. You can see they require this Hanami interactor gem. But down here it says should only have 2 public methods, initialize and call. And back in their 1.3 guides, I think they were really trying to force that convention on you. Only make a class that has 2 public methods as a way of, I don't know, separating your concerns even more, separating responsibility even more. But it doesn't exist in the 2.0 guides, so maybe they've forgotten about that. Anyway, so there's a gem file. We got .env. We don't have Hanami. If we go back, Hanami interactor. They also got rid of that from the 1.3. There's a lot of changes from 1.3 to 2.0, which is what we're currently at. So they're obviously still trying to figure it out, still trying to work out what's good. And then, all right, so back in our class, we've called a Google key. This is just a JSON file that you can get from Google. Don't worry too much about that. Just Don't worry that it's like sitting in a public folder. It's all right. And then obviously we create an instance variable called session. We're using this Google Drive Ruby gem. Then we can allow to receive any other spreadsheet keys or any other worksheet titles if we want to change it. But by default, we're providing the default environment variables. So we call a session. This is just the Google Drive API session. Get the spreadsheet by the key, get the worksheet from that spreadsheet, and then get the rows from that worksheet. So we had that. This, if we call spreadsheet.new.fetch, I know that in itself is probably an anti-pattern, but there's a reason why it has to be like that, which I'll show later on. You're wondering why isn't like self.fetch? Why isn't it a class method? Well, we have to use it like that later on. Maybe one of the flaws of Hanami at its current state. So anyway, this is kind of the output. If you refer back to my spreadsheet, I don't know if you can see the top row, it says like player, position, start, change, price, and that's all like the rows from the first. And then you can see it goes on. I can assure you it works. All right, so that's tick. First thing done, fetch data from a spreadsheet. But that's not really a Hanami way of doing it. So I'm going to move that back and refactor that. The Hanami wants us to do it a different way. It's a thing called providers. So providers is something that Hanami is unique to Hanami, maybe useful for if you want specific instances of an object that are used by multiple components. If you have dependencies with non-trivial configuration, like a third-party library or anything that would go in your lib directory, or if you want to take advantage of Hanami's lifecycle methods, prepare, start, stop. I now have limited experience with like React, and they used to have like these lifecycle methods. Might be familiar in that regard. So yeah, we were accessing Google Drive, creating Google Drive session. That's a specific instance with a specific config. And we want to, maybe potentially we want to use that Google Drive session in multiple classes, multiple places without going to Google Drive every single time. We want it just once. Even we want the spreadsheet data to load just once. It takes about 5 seconds. We don't want to do that every single time. So this is from their Hanami guides, the provider lifecycle. Essentially, there's 3 methods that are provided. Prepare, start, and stop. They're kind of self-explanatory. You can see they've required whatever libraries they need to require in here. In this particular instance, they've also registered another provider called a database. And then in the start, this is where it happens. They start the connection, and stop is like tear down or close the connection. So let's see if we can refactor my Google Drive session with providers. So we've got to prepare, start, and stop. We don't actually need stop for this because we don't need to close our Google Drive session. So we'll prepare it in the same way. We'll require Google Drive in that prepare statement, prepare block. And then we'll add our Google Drive key, our JSON. We'll call a session there from that key. And this is one of Hanami's the provider's unique methods. It's always a register method. This is what's going to make it publicly available to whatever component you need, whatever class you need. So register will take 2 arguments. First is a namespace. It can be anything you want. Does not have to be the same as what you called it up here. I call it Google Drive session, but it makes sense that I call it Google Drive session. The file is called Google Drive session. So we call this provider Google Drive session. And I can call that, say in the Hanami console with hanami.app, Google Drive session. It's just a hash. And that key will provide you this instance of a session. And indeed it does. You just got to trust me on that. Yes, I'll take some questions. Roy. There's a different block text shared variables. I believe not. I believe not. I think I tried it. No. Oh, actually, yeah, I haven't tried it. I'm sure you could use instance variable if it's just Ruby. It's just a block, but I don't, I haven't got that far yet. There's another way of using other providers. If you use the word target, that's calling, in this case, it's calling Hanami app. The app itself is a target. So you can say target square brackets settings is another default provider. That's where you might store some environment variables or whatever, other settings you might want. So in short, I don't have an answer to your question, Roy. But if you got any other questions, feel free to yell them out. So back to our spreadsheet class, let's refactor this. We go back one slide. It's all well and good to have this, we can use hanami.app Google Drive session, but how are we actually going to use it? So here's our spreadsheet class. What we have here is dependency injection. So Hanami has this thing called DEPs, DEPS, dependencies, mix-ins. And we can see in here, we've got many dependencies already that we want to sort of extract out of this knowledge. The spreadsheet class does not even need to know that it's a Google Drive session. It could be from any other session. Get an Excel session somehow. It shouldn't need to know about that. So we can get rid of some stuff. What can we do? We can add a little space there, and we're going to include our dependencies, include deps. This is the syntax. And because we defined it earlier as hanami.app Google Drive session, we can call it here as Google Drive session. And that's going to be available, I believe, in the initialize method. So we can use it down at the bottom. So we replace add session with Google Drive session. I think it functions the same as like an attribute reader. We have this Google Drive session now available to the class, to the instance. So now we don't need the session variable anymore, so we can get rid of that. We don't need the Google key anymore because we can get rid of Google Drive because we don't need the Google Drive anymore, and we can get rid of Google key. So we're starting to remove all these dependencies out of this class. And then we don't even need an initialize method. So this is where we went before when we said spreadsheet.new.fetch. We can't just have a class variable, can't call self.fetch and use dependencies. I tried doing that, and I learned that no, it's the dependencies somehow are initialized in the initialize method. So if you want to use these dependencies, you have to use instance methods. So we can get rid of that empty space. Next thing we can do, we can also change the namespace here. If we don't want to call it Google Drive session and type out all those characters, we can just call it session. So that we can call, at the bottom, we can just call that variable session. So you can name it whatever you want, and we'll just fix up the alignment. So just like that, we've got a much cleaner class right there. There's another thing you could do that I alluded to earlier, that you could even just get another provider for the spreadsheet data. But no, that's too much work right now. We've come far enough. So the same thing, spreadsheet.new.fetch will still work. Imagine that I wrote a test, it would still pass. That's my test, my acceptance test. So we'll turn that orange into a green for now. This is me giving myself my own approvals. All right. Task number 2, take a breath. We're going to store the data in a database. We're not going to, all right, that first ticket has probably the most amount of code. The rest of it doesn't have too much code. Only because I didn't get around to it. So let's store the data in a database. But Hanami has a specific way that it likes to do it. It's the repository pattern. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. I have only just become to learn that because this is, as someone who just knows Rails, it's not what I deal with. So this is like, for me, it's a good learning experience. So obviously in Rails, they use active record. You can do stuff like this. You can say book, you can book.new, you can give it a name, you can give it a price. You can save that instance and it'll create a record in the database. Then you can call these various different methods on the book class, the book model. Say find by the name. You can inject some SQL query into there. Price is greater than 100. You can put a scope. I've got a scope called premium. It might be like expensive books. These are the different things you can do with Rails, with active record. Probably what makes our lives as Rails developers fun is you can do all these different things. But that has its trade-offs in Rails. You know, that's probably where some of the slowness of Rails comes from. All these pre-built methods. So Hanami, the repository pattern, pretty much is separating entity from persistence. So the entity being entities, repositories, and persistence. The entity is what gets stored in the database, like the name, the price, all the attributes. Whereas a repository is the interacting with it. It's like a messenger. So I know we have like someone in our company keeps talking about how they want to like separate model from database interaction. This is probably what they're on about. So separation of concerns again. Hanami on their guides, their 2.0 guides, they actually recommend that you use this ROM RB gem. It's Ruby object mapper. I've had a look at it. It's a lot to learn, but it seems well fleshed out. So this is their way of their preference for persistence, the database. That's the end of that part of the ticket. I'm not going to do the code. You can read the guides. It's just coding. You don't want to see that anymore. So I'll move that into my backlog and I'll work on that later. Let's skip to this next ticket. Let's create an endpoint to return the data. Rails and Hanami are very similar in the routes. You got your config/routes file. Pretty similar. We've got one endpoint. It's books slash. So usually in Rails, you might make a books controller with a bunch of different methods, all those basic CRUD methods. You might have book params. And then, but the problem with that is you're gonna test your controller, test all your methods in there, which people don't recommend anymore. Or do you want to, write request specs instead? Well, Hanami has a different way of doing things. Sorry if that's too small right now, but it's going to get bigger. So rather than say in Rails, we have a method for every endpoint. Hanami has a class for every endpoint. And in my opinion, it makes it much more easier to unit test every single thing that you're doing. You can test like the sad paths and all the validations of every single method without like blowing up your spec file too big, your test file. So let's add, it's got a handle method, which I think is a convention of this Hanami action class. It's got to have a handle method, which has requests and response. You can add another middleware method in there, middleware parameter. And that's going to do the thing. Don't worry about the implementation. We can add some params. And this is where dry types comes in. These are the attributes that it's going to accept. Before in Rails, we had the private params method, book params. This is the dry types way. I think it's much more readable. You have a required field title, it's a string. That's all pretty readable in my opinion. A couple optional attributes. So you have params. You can have another private method to validate them. You can even like create your own class, validate a class, and just plug that in there. And just like Rails, you can put a before action in there, whether or not you like hooks or not. Actually, yeah, that's the end. That's the end of that ticket as well. That's the action. There's an endpoint. Yeah, you can just go Hanami Hanami server, hit that endpoint, and something will come out. In this case, nothing will come out because there's nothing in that code. But believe me, something will come out at that index endpoint. So back on just rehashing the pros and cons. Yeah, it's faster and lighter APIs. Forces good developer habits, and it's just fun to try something new. And the cons, it's still quite new. There's still, I'd probably like wait like a year, 2 years, or you can like open source, try and write some features for them. That's what Rob told me to do, but I haven't got around to that yet. It's my thoughts. Yep, I'm trying to write an API, just a small one, in Hanami, just as a learning exercise. But yeah, if you want to like take away with a big, huge product, probably not yet. You might run into some problems, just like my squad did earlier in the year. Cost us like 3 weeks. Yeah, that's it. That's Hanami. That's my take. Thanks.